So I started this paper thinking about Delta Dawn, and so I started writing this paper seriously after watching a performance by Tanya Tucker singing Delta Dawn on Hee Haw in 1972. So Hee Haw is a secret, accurate history of the genre, of American country music, kind of encompassing that everything that we're embarrassed to admit, via the genre, corn-pone jokes about horrific domestic melodrama as a kind of case study in the relief theory of humor, made more so because the jokes aren't very funny and the melodrama is so deliberately crafted. The art of it provides less relief and a more soft juxtaposition. So in this segment, Tanya Tucker is 13, and she's singing her hit song Delta Dawn, and she's wearing this orange prairie-style dress, and we see this wide shot of her and the entire band, and then it narrows into a medium shot, and then to a close-up of her face. She keeps singing, and she sings in this sort of quiet and delicate voice. She doesn't quite sound 13, but she doesn't sound like an adult. Reading the AP wires and the popular press about her in concert around this time, and in concert with men like Mel Tillis and Tom T. Hall, industry veterans for decades, you get her described as things like her raw barroom voice, or that little girl with a big voice, or that little girl with a woman's voice, or that great big voice, or dynamo, or an ingenue. She's not cultish enough to be an ingenue. She isn't trading into that kind of power. She isn't as barn-burning as a dynamo. That would come in the early 1980s with her album TNT. Her voice actually isn't very big. It's clear and precise, but quiet. It would be out of place in a barroom. Thinking about where that voice comes from, thinking about the power of her singing as a kind of resistance, I'm thinking about her father. Her father was a truck driver and construction worker who figured out Tanya was a better meal ticket than him driving truck. And so he moved the family around a lot trying to find Tanya a career. They grew up in Texas. They moved to suburban Phoenix. He spent time in Utah, which he had a bit part in Jeremiah Johnson. She auditioned for a much larger role. And there was spent time in Las Vegas, where he met Bill Sherrill at a casino and pressed a tape of Tanya singing in his hand. And in the midst of all of this moving around, he also spent time in Nashville and Los Angeles trying to get Tanya working from the age of 10. Nashville is often said to be a 10-year town where you have a career after 10 years. Tanya made it in 3 years in a 10-year town because of this pressure. And that has to be one of the reasons why she ended up singing a number of really oddly Southern Gothic songs, more adult material than her age would indicate. And these aren't, so they were sort of like the kind of songs of Dolly Parton sang around the time of Me and Little Andy, or Down from Dover or the like. But Dolly was older, and Dolly was very much perpetuating a sort of Appalachian tradition. Tanya never had that geography, had that connection to the geographical center of storytelling. So Tucker played this sort of passel Southern Gothic songs around this time, charted very well with them. And they had three things in common which I thought were really interesting. She was much too young to sing them. She didn't play the ingenue, and she didn't play young. And they were about the isolation of being a woman, an adult woman, and an aging woman. So she was almost playing a role. She was acting. It's kind of age drag. So let me break for a second before I continue and tell you the plots of some of these songs that charted in the early 1970s, including Delta Dawn. Delta Dawn, A woman is jilted by her lover. She spends the next 40 years wandering around Brownsville, Tennessee, waiting for him to return. He doesn't. What's your mama's name? A man named Buford Wilson spends 30 years asking passerbyers who their mothers are after moving somewhere between Memphis and Memphis and New Orleans. He eventually offers a child 5 cents of candy. To answer the question, he is arrested for enticing a child, goes to prison, has hard labor. When he's released from prison, returns to Memphis, dies in a flop house. A letter is found on his body after he's died, where proves through the color of her eyes the child he asks that imprisons him is actually his daughter. Blood red and going down. A child accompanies her father to a barroom where her mother and her lover are congregating. The father shoots the mother and the lover. Would you lay with me? A woman asks for a man to lay with her in the graveyard. Lay with here being the obvious sexual metaphor, and also something more ghostly. The man who turned my mother on. A traveling salesman elopes with a housewife and dies when the child is 5. As an adult, the child asks questions about her father. Lizzie and the Rain Man. A Rain Man, a kind of shamanic figure, comes to visit a small-town Texas under drought. He meets a local woman. They fall in love. So there are 6 things you can see in common with Tucker's in this material. There's a sense of Gothic or the otherworldly. There's a sense of loss, and that sense of loss is connected to a very explicit peripatetic movement, especially men leaving and us not knowing where men are. There's obviously a sense of death and a memory of death that occurs consistently, and there's a playing outside of age, and in the case of What's Your Mama's Name, a playing outside of gender. So there's obviously some Freudian connections made between her singing about loss and peripatetic man and her relationship with her father. I want to put a pin in that. There's not enough time to go into it. But I think there's something to notice, thinking about other teenage songs who play about sex and death. They are songs by teenagers and for teenagers, these sort of teenage death songs. The fear of death is an early death, connected to a transition from adolescence to adulthood. Thinking about, we can trace a line straight through, right? We can listen to like Last Kiss, or Leader of the Pack, or Teen Angel, and then continue that line all the way into sort of Van Perry's If I Die Young. Tucker's really interesting because she seems to be incapable of being young at all, and so I keep thinking about the cinematic here, right? Like, she's not connected to Dolly because of the lack of geography, and she's not connected to these teenage death songs because she's playing age drag, and she's very much acting in a set of roles. So, thinking about the closest connections that she makes, and how she constructs drama, how she tells stories, even how she embodies the much older or actors in the 70s who are not musicians. She really could be considered a mirror of Jodie Foster or Tatum O'Neal. We're thinking of Tatum O'Neal in Paper Moon. She's older than her time. She's playing these cons with her person who may or may not be her father, but the father was teaching her how to be a con artist. So the juxtaposition is between them, an adult and a child. The power then is resting in her childhood. In a similar sense to the moral panic that you can see in Taxi Driver occurs because of Jodie Foster's being 13. The failure of Jodie Foster to act older, even when she's performing these extremely adult acts. The closest we can almost see is the very strange movie Bugsy Malone with Jodie Foster playing an adult gangster's mole, but even then it's an Alan Parker movie, and it is very much a kind of camp theatrics. It's a joke. Tucker isn't joking in these songs. But they do have something in common, which is interesting. They have odd stuttering, stop-start career, and the question then becomes how to translate this question of childhood into adulthood, how they succeed or fail in that context. And I think Tucker does this by how these figures were so far away from childhood, be at the beginning a question of learning how to be an adult. And I think Tucker does this by very explicitly connecting to a series of adult roles. And I think so does, less successfully Neil and very successfully Foster. The adult roles for Tucker, as I said, were her album TNT, which sort of, although technically an Adolescent Rebellion album done at 21, is an album where she isn't playing the roles her father wants her to play. And that stop and stuttering of Tucker's career is also really interesting in the sense that she never quite succeeds in the potential of her earliest work. But when she gets closest, it gets really interesting. I'm also thinking about her last album and the concert tour that she did, and her singing Delta Dawn at the age where Delta Dawn would have been, so more age appropriate, but containing this weight of past representations and history and mourning and her own personal space, has a depth and a darkness where finally she earns her material. And I think part of that earning of that material comes from who she worked with as well. On the comeback album in 2019, where she finally won a Grammy, she works with Shooter Jennings, Waylon Jennings' son, and in her touring band and her opening act were Merle Haggard's sons as well. And so she enters into this mentorship position where part of her teaching being an adult is she teaches them how to be an adult. She teaches them how to sort of history of country music, and she continues the sort of like moving away from the sort of juxtaposition between childhood and adulthood that marred much of her early work. And so the uncanniness of Delta Dawn, which initially was a child playing so well at being an adult, becomes again an adult claiming a childhood that was never her own. So in this sense, I'm thinking again about what we do with that kind of legend status, that we tend to give them credit instead of resources. And I'm just going to finish up with one thought about Holly Gleason, the producer and writer. And she says over and over again that she brings up this idea that we claim lip service to legends, but they don't sell. So, in conclusion, I want to ask a question. What does it mean if you know that Tucker is performing these songs, being an adult, aging into character studies, but continually caught with a sort of childhood history? And I think that that's the ongoing crisis of Tucker, is that we don't know what to do with her history. We don't know how to absorb her ongoing success as an artist because of the strangeness of the earliness of her career. I suspect that's also why she's not in the Hall of Fame, is this conception of the prodigy continues. So I think that's what I have to say about sort of Tanya Tucker in childhood. It's a very weird way of doing it, and so I don't know how the Q&A is going to work, and I'm sorry about any of the noise and traffic and all of that. Thanks, bye.